How you doing, guys? Today I'm giving you a little bit of like where the hell have I been update. We've had a pretty catastrophic situation happen to the RJ35. I'll show you in a second, which kind of put the emergency brake on that project, and the owner of the tractor itself is kind of weighing the options, and again, I'll show you in a second as to which direction he or we are going to go on it. The other thing too is I bought a bucket list item of my life a few weeks ago, so I've been playing around with that. It's basically a toy. I started making a video of it. I may post a video, I may not, but in general. And then last weekend was the holiday, so the last 2 or 3 weeks have been kind of preoccupied with something else, and then what I'm about to show you is the issues with the RJ35. So with that being said, let's dive into it. The issue with the RJ35 stems from the motor, unfortunately. I'm going to kind of move in a little closer, let you take a gander at what we got. So when we look at the motor, before I tell you what's wrong, you might actually see it right this second. I'll look this over fairly quick, not quickly, but good, and see if you can figure out what the issue is. I'll wait just a couple more seconds here. All right. The issue is our crankshaft doesn't have any threads left. Oh boy. Yep. So what happened was I went to take the flywheel nut off, and it literally just fell off in my hand. I was starting a video. I was just going to kind of break it loose first and then show you how I tear it apart. It fell right off. I don't even know how it stayed on. Now, here is the reason it did that. Here's the end of the crank. It's right here. Now, if we take a look, if you see right here at the 12 o'clock position, there's a chip like missing, okay? And if we look at it, it's actually, there we go. It's actually twisted. You can actually see that that is where the crack in the crank started. And then when I turned it, it fractured off. Now, there's also another sign here, unfortunately. If we take a look, there's a crack going right up the center of the keyway on the flywheel. Unfortunately, what has happened is somebody over-torqued the bolt on the crank. Now, it was even more compounded by this washer that someone used. So, in a nutshell, what happened is the flywheel's on the motor, or on the crank. We had the spacer, or this washer, and then this Shinaki nut. This spacer was used so they could space the nut out far enough for the Shinaki recoil to grip it. This is not the correct nut for this motor. This is probably for like a Kohler engine, which has a different shaped flywheel. The Clinton ones, as far as I remember, I don't have one to show you, but the nuts are usually a little bit longer. So that way you didn't have to run this. So basically what happened was somebody put the flywheel on, they put this spacer on, and then they put this Shinaki nut in this position on the crank. Well, obviously, it just gripped the end of the crank, okay? Because you got to get through the flywheel, through the spacer, to the nut. So the nut was only on maybe about this far. And when they torqued this nut on, they over-torqued the whole situation. They caused a fracture, which you can see right there. There's a little bit of a twist in the crack right there. They caused a fracture or a stretch in the crank end, and then they over-tightened it to the point where it even cracked the flywheel. So the flywheel's junk, the crank is junk, and we're at a crossroads here. I don't have, so this has a Type 1 ignition on it, okay? It's even missing the cover that's supposed to be here, so that's missing, but it's got a Type 1 ignition. This is a Type 1 style flywheel. You can see it's really thin right in this area. And I don't have another crank. But I have another motor that we could use, but that's set up for a Type 2 ignition. Now the problem here is I could probably find a Type 1 style or a 1200 style crank to put in this, but I don't have a Type 1 flywheel. So I have enough ignition parts to do a Type 1, but I don't have a flywheel. I could swap this motor with another motor that I have that has a Type 2, but the problem with that is I have a Type 2 flywheel, but I don't have enough Type 2 ignition parts. So I don't really have enough parts to put everything together to get an engine together. So that's where the owner's kind of like trying to figure out what he wants to do. I personally told him just find another Clinton motor and just swap a different Clinton. This is not the original motor to this tractor, so it doesn't matter. My personal opinion is to go ahead and just swap another Clinton motor on it. So let me go out to the shed real quick. Let me pull out the Type 2 flywheel so you can see the differences. And yeah, we'll go from there. The Type 2 ignition flywheel is on the right hand side, and you can just see how much beefier it is right around the crank area. So you could theoretically over torque this one. It probably wouldn't crack, but this one was so paper thin when they went to town on it. So that's the difference. You can see here, I'll stack them up so you can kind of see the difference. So that's a Type 2. This is a Type 1. You can see the difference where the magnets are totally different. The flywheel's this one's actually balanced. This one is sort of balanced. The top of them are completely different. You can see the differences in there. This is just a lighter duty kind of flywheel. This is I wouldn't say heavier duty, but compared to this one, it's more heavy duty. Another question would be, well, why don't you just swap a Type 2 ignition or whatever? The other layer to all of this is the bearing plates. Now, a 1200 has a standard roller bearing in it. So the block and the bearing plate are casted in such a way that it has a standard roller bearing, kind of like an R12. It's just bigger, but like an R12 roller bearing, standard roller bearing. For the most part, once you get to like the A1200 to a point, and definitely with the B1290s, the cranks are on tapered roller bearings. So there is a tapered race pressed into the bearing plate and a tapered race pressed into the block. So you can't really swap a Type 2 ignition onto a Type 1 engine because the cranks won't swap because of the bearings. The bearing plates don't swap because of the crank bearings. They're also casted in such a way that this would only accept the Type 1, the other one will only accept the Type 2, and then you have to have the appropriate flywheel. So although the motors themselves externally look exactly the same, there's a lot of little nuances between the actual engine models. And unfortunately, I don't have enough loose parts to make one engine. I do have an engine out in the shed that's a Type 2, like I said, but I don't have all the ignition parts. I got a flywheel, right? I have the bearing plate. All the motor's all set to go. I just got to scrounge together enough parts to make the ignition. Oh, and then the other thing too, on the crank, where is it? Right there. Okay, there's a keyed a cam lobe on the crank. It slides on, and here, I'll pull it off. And what that is, that's actually the points indexer. And I think this thing's even cracked, if I remember correctly. These can crack like right here. Oh, these can crack in the thin area, but this one's not. But yeah, so you got to have this also, and these are different between the two ignition systems because the points are not in the same they're physically not in the same spot. So whatever. So that's the holdup here with the RJ35. Once I get, oh, hang on, I think I'm going to sneeze. All right, no. Once I get word from the owner on which direction we're going in, and then the RJ35 project will come back. Real quick on the Senior, a couple people asked me about the Senior. There is a gearbox that goes between the transmission right here and the drive shaft to the rear. My gearbox was in pretty rough shape, so there's a gentleman that is machining a new gearbox for me. I haven't heard anything. I'm not going to pressure him. You know, once he'll get in contact with me. Once that's done, I'll be in a position to get back on my Senior. But for now, that is the update on the RJ35. Hopefully next weekend or in the next week or two, we'll get some more physical work done on this thing. We'll get it started, hopefully take it out for a ride, and then we'll go from there. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to everyone who reached out to me and asked me where the heck I was. Really do appreciate that. And until we get a word on what to do here, you guys have a great day.